Human papillomavirus, my education presentation by Valerie Graham, Christopher Michigan University, Nursing 322. The education project I chose was option 4. It was the presentation of a lecture to peers and or junior nursing students. This presentation includes a PowerPoint, a video, and 2 posters to address some learning styles. The lecture begins with a pre-test to test the knowledge of the students and ends with a post-test to assess if the learning objectives were met. The learning theories I used was the first one, cognitive learning theory. This is used in education. It is noted as a highly active process greatly directed by the individual and perceiving the information and interpreting it to what they already know and reorganizing it into new insights and an understanding. Also, I used adult learning. This is one way to promote a culture of lifelong learning and enhance excellence within nursing. Goals and objectives. The teaching goal for this lecture is by the end of the course, learners will be able to identify ways to prevent contracting HPV. The learning objectives is to identify what HPV is, identify how HPV is prevented, and identify how HPV is treated. The pretest. What does HPV stand for? How is HPV transmitted? Is HPV effectively treatable? Is there a cure for HPV? Is there a vaccination for HPV? And true or false, HPV alone causes cancer. By the end of this lecture, the learner should be able to answer these questions. Human papillomavirus, also known as HPV, is an infection considered as the most common viral sexually transmitted infection worldwide. Persistent HPV infection is one of the most important sexually transmitted diseases associated with more than 5% of all cancers in the world. About 70% of sexually active women are infected, and most of these infections heal within many weeks or months. Human papillomavirus is the leading cause of cervical cancer. HPV is also an important causative factor in a number of other reported cancers in women and men, such as oropharyngeal, anal, vaginal, vulvar, and penile cancers. It is important to understand that HPV alone does not cause cancer, but requires triggers like smoking, folate deficiency, UV light exposure, immunosuppressants, and pregnancy. An HPV subtype 6 and 11 are low risk. But if a patient is diagnosed with the HPV subtype 16 and 18, these are noted as high risk and are responsible for about 70% of cases globally. Here is a video about HPV. It's very informational. It's about 5 minutes long.
He knows a lot about the science stuff. Professor Dave explains. Human papillomavirus, or HPV, is an incredibly common sexually transmitted infection that affects humans of all genders worldwide. In the United States alone, CDC estimates that upwards of 79 million Americans currently have HPV, and that around 14 million people will become newly infected each year. Truly, HPV is so common that essentially every person who is sexually active will likely get HPV at some point in their life, provided they don't get the HPV vaccine. It turns out papillomaviruses aren't unique to humans. They're actually exceptionally common throughout the animal kingdom, but each virus can only infect a single species. Depending on the host, papillomaviruses are capable of causing lytic, chronic, latent, and transforming infections. Human papillomaviruses in particular can cause warts, and several genotypes of these viruses are associated with certain types of cancer. Papillomaviruses are part of the Papillomaviridae family, and they are small, non-enveloped viruses with icosahedral capsids and double-stranded DNA genomes. The tricky thing about papillomaviruses is that they encode proteins that promote cell growth. From a virus's standpoint, that's great. The ability to promote cell growth helps the virus carry out a lytic replication cycle. From a human or animal's perspective, it's not the best news for a few reasons. First, as we recall, lytic replication essentially means the virus infiltrates a host cell, uses all the host cell machinery to replicate many times, and then explodes its way out of the host cell, destroying it and delivering new virions to the surrounding cells. Second, these viruses have the potential to oncogenically transform a non-permissive cell, which basically means triggering uncontrolled cell growth. This is known by another name, cancer. Over 100 types of human papillomaviruses have been identified, which are classified based on their DNA sequence homology. HPV can be further subcategorized depending on the type of tissue they infect, as either cutaneous HPV, which means infecting the skin, or mucosal HPV, which means infecting mucosal membranes. Within the mucosal HPV category, there is a group of viruses associated with cervical cancer, but more on that in a moment. Human papillomavirus is transmitted sexually through skin-to-skin contact. Let's break down what happens next. The virus is able to enter the basal layer of the epidermis through tiny breaks in the skin. Once inside, the virus triggers cell growth, which allows the virus to make even more copies of itself, since more host cells means more virions. All those extra cells are what cause warts, a potential symptom of HPV. Of course, not everyone infected with HPV develops warts, and in fact, most people who get HPV have no symptoms at all. So why does it vary so much? HPV expresses different viral genes depending on the type and layer of skin that the virus has broken into, with the added variable that the different types of HPV are very tissue-specific. In particular, two strains of the virus, HPV 16 and HPV 18, are responsible for about 70% of cervical cancer cases. The other 30% of cancer cases are caused by a dozen or so high-risk HPV strains. Yet another thing that helps this virus spread so easily is the fact that a person infected with HPV can still pass the virus to someone even if they have no visible symptoms. In most cases, HPV goes away on its own without causing any health problems. But for those cases where HPV sticks around, it can cause either genital warts, which can be treated with prescription medication, or different kinds of cancer. In addition to cervical cancer and other genital-specific cancers, HPV can also cause cancer in the back of the throat. Cancers caused by HPV can take years or even decades to develop, so it's always a good idea to get regular checkups. For women between the ages of 21 and 65, getting regular screenings can catch the very early stages of cancer and prevent it from developing. Ultimately, there are a number of ways that you can lower your chances of getting HPV. Of course, proper condom use can help. There's also an HPV vaccine that's safe and effective against cancer-causing strains of HPV. Either way, making sure to visit the doctor for regular checkups can catch issues before they become more serious, just the same as pretty much all health conditions. And that covers the basics regarding HPV. Thanks for watching, guys. Subscribe to my channel for more tutorials. Support me on Patreon so I can keep making content. And as always, feel free to email me, ProfessorDaveExplains@gmail.com.
How HPV is prevented? Well, as the video showed, that it's prevented with the vaccination. Fun facts are that boys and girls can get the vaccine. Every year, 34,800 people in the U.S. develop HPV-related cancer. HPV causes more mouth and throat cancer than smoking. 79 million Americans are infected with HPV. Most infections go away on their own, but sometimes they can lead to cancer. The HPV vaccine protects against 6 kinds of cancer. HPV vaccine is very safe and can prevent over 90% of all HPV cancers. And lastly, 9 to 12 years is the optimal age for the vaccine because the vaccine works much better during the preteen years than when given later. How is HPV prevented? 100% prevention is from safe sex or abstaining from sex, which also includes oral and anal sex. The goal of the HPV vaccination is to prevent invasive cancer, cervical cancer, by preventing infection with major oncogenic types of HPV. Just to note a fact, in a study among Swedish girls and women ages 10 to 30 years old, the HPV vaccine was associated with a substantially reduced risk of invasive cervical cancer at the population level. Here is a poster about the HPV vaccine. Treatment and diagnosis. There are no definite successful treatments noted for the HPV virus. It is also known that it can go away over time. The diagnosis is how it is diagnosed is the detection of HPV occurs macroscopically in women and men, and the diagnosis of the precursors of cervical carcinoma in women is possibly by pap smears. So it's important to get annual checkups for women in cervical exams and pap smears. In early detection, during puberty and throughout a woman's childbearing years, the female reproductive system undergoes a normal physiological process. During this time, cells form and reproduce. As a result, it is recommended that by the age of 21, that women should have regular cervical cancer screenings for HPV. Here's a list of the references that was used along with that YouTube video. And then lastly, here's a post test to measure if the learning objectives were met. Thank you.